Detective James Peterson checked his watch as he walked through the marble hallways of the county courthouse. It was just another Tuesday morning, and he had a testimony to give in about 15 minutes. Nothing unusual about that. In his 12 years on the force, he'd testified in court more times than he could count. Armed robberies, domestic disputes, DUI cases, you name it, he'd probably been called to testify about it at some point. But today's case was different. Not because it was particularly interesting or complicated. Actually, it was quite the opposite. This was about as simple as it gets, a basic traffic violation. 3 weeks ago, he'd pulled someone over for running a red light. That was it. No drama, no arguments, no arrests. Just a routine traffic stop that took maybe 10 minutes out of his day. James had almost forgotten about it entirely until he got the court summons last week. The driver had apparently decided to fight the ticket instead of just paying the fine. He understood why some people did that. Sometimes the insurance increase costs more than the ticket itself. Sometimes people genuinely believe they didn't do anything wrong. And sometimes people just want their day in court. He pushed open the heavy wooden door to courtroom 5B and stepped inside. The room had that distinct courthouse smell, a mixture of old wood, floor polish, and the faint scent of coffee from the bailiff's desk. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead, casting everything in that slightly harsh glow that made everyone look a bit more tired than they actually were. The courtroom was mostly empty. A few people sat scattered in the gallery, probably witnesses for other cases scheduled later in the morning. The prosecutor was already there, a middle-aged man in a gray suit who was shuffling through papers at his table. He looked up when James entered and gave him a quick nod of recognition. James took a seat on one of the benches near the front and pulled out the small notebook he always carried. He'd learned early in his career to write down everything, no matter how minor it seemed at the time. Details that seemed obvious in the moment had a funny way of getting fuzzy after a few weeks. He flipped through the pages until he found his notes from that day. September 23rd. Clear afternoon, good visibility. He'd been sitting at the intersection of Hamilton Street and Fifth Avenue, running radar and watching traffic. It was a spot known for violations. People often tried to beat the light there because the next intersection was almost a mile down the road. At 3:47 p.m., he'd observed a black Honda Accord enter the intersection after the light had already turned red. Not one of those borderline cases where the light turns red just as someone's crossing. This was clear-cut. The light had been red for a good 4 seconds before the car went through. He'd activated his lights and followed the vehicle. The driver had pulled over quickly and without any issues. Professional, polite, cooperative. The whole thing had been textbook. He'd explained the violation. The driver had accepted the ticket without arguing, and that was that. Or so he'd thought, Detective Peterson. The prosecutor had walked over and extended his hand. Thanks for coming in. This should be quick and straightforward. James shook his hand and stood up. No problem. Pretty simple case from what I remember. Should be, the prosecutor agreed, glancing at his notes, though I noticed the defendant isn't here yet. Their attorney called earlier and said they'd be arriving shortly. Some kind of conflict with another court matter, apparently. James raised an eyebrow. They have an attorney for a traffic ticket? The prosecutor shrugged. Some people really don't want points on their license. Or maybe they've had violations before and this one would push them over some threshold. Who knows? Either way, we're ready when they are. The bailiff's voice suddenly rang out across the courtroom. All rise for the Honorable Judge William Foster. Everyone in the courtroom stood as an older judge with white hair and reading glasses entered from the side door. He took his seat at the bench, arranged some papers, and then looked around the courtroom with a slight frown. Where's the defendant in case number 2024 T8847? The prosecutor stepped forward. Your Honor, we were informed the defendant would be arriving shortly. There was apparently a scheduling conflict. Judge Foster looked at his watch with obvious irritation. This case was scheduled for 9 a.m. It's now 9:15. I have a full docket today, Counselor. I understand, Your Honor. Perhaps we could... The courtroom door opened and everyone turned to look. A woman in a navy blue suit walked in, carrying a leather briefcase. She was probably in her mid-40s with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. There was something about the way she carried herself that caught James's attention. Confident but not arrogant, the kind of presence that comes from someone who spent a lot of time in professional settings. My apologies, Your Honor, she said, her voice calm and clear as she walked toward the front of the courtroom. I was held up in another matter. Judge Foster peered at her over his reading glasses. And you are? I'm here regarding case 2024 T8847, she replied. But she didn't sit down at the defendant's table. Instead, she walked past it and took a seat in the gallery, right in the second row. The prosecutor looked confused. Your Honor, is this the defendant's attorney? The woman in the navy suit remained quiet, simply watching the proceedings with an unreadable expression. Judge Foster shuffled through his papers again, looking increasingly frustrated. This is highly irregular, he muttered. Bailiff, can you check with the clerk's office? There seems to be some confusion about this case. The bailiff nodded and left through the side door. An awkward silence fell over the courtroom. James found himself studying the woman in the navy suit. There was definitely something familiar about her, but he couldn't quite place it. Had he seen her around the courthouse before? Maybe she was a lawyer he'd encountered on another case. The prosecutor cleared his throat. Your Honor, perhaps while we're waiting for clarity on the defendant's status, we could at least proceed with the officer's testimony. Detective Peterson is here and ready. Judge Foster considered this for a moment, then nodded. Very well. Detective Peterson, please approach the witness stand. James stood up and walked to the witness box. He placed his hand on the Bible as the bailiff approached. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. James took his seat in the witness box and settled in. He'd done this countless times before. State your name, badge number, how long you've been on the force. Describe what you observed. Stick to the facts, don't embellish. Don't speculate, simple. The prosecutor began with the standard questions, and James answered them automatically, his mind partly on his responses and partly still puzzled by the woman in the gallery. As he started to describe the events of September 23rd, he noticed her lean forward slightly, her attention completely focused on him, and then it hit him. The sudden flash of recognition that made his next words catch in his throat for just a second. He knew exactly who she was and where he'd seen her before. She was the driver, the woman he'd pulled over for running that red light 3 weeks ago. But why was she sitting in the gallery instead of at the defendant's table? And why was she dressed like she'd just stepped out of a law firm or... His thought was interrupted by the bailiff returning to the courtroom, this time with a clerk who was carrying additional files. The clerk approached Judge Foster and whispered something to him. The judge's expression shifted from irritation to surprise, and then to something James couldn't quite read. Judge Foster looked up at the courtroom, then specifically at the woman in the navy suit. I see. Well, this is certainly unexpected. The woman met his gaze steadily, and James could swear he saw the slightest hint of a smile at the corner of her mouth. Something was happening here, something unusual, and he had a feeling that this routine traffic case was about to become anything but routine. James sat in the witness box, trying to keep his expression neutral even though his mind was racing. The woman in the navy suit was definitely the driver he'd pulled over. He was certain of it now. Same face, same calm demeanor, but nothing about this situation made sense. Judge Foster set down the papers the clerk had brought him and cleared his throat. It appears there's been an administrative error with this case. A significant one. He paused, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. We're going to need to take a short recess while we sort this out. Detective Peterson, you can step down for now, but please remain in the courthouse. James nodded and left the witness stand, relief and confusion mixing together in his chest. As he walked back to his seat in the gallery, he couldn't help but glance at the woman in the navy suit. She was gathering her briefcase, her face showing no emotion whatsoever. Whatever was going on, she clearly already knew about it. The bailiff called out, "Court is in recess for 15 minutes. Everyone stood as Judge Foster left through his chamber's door. As soon as he was gone, the courtroom erupted in whispered conversations. The prosecutor looked baffled, flipping through his files as if the answer might suddenly appear there. A few people in the gallery were already pulling out their phones, probably texting colleagues about whatever strange thing was happening. James stayed in his seat, watching as the woman in the navy suit spoke briefly with the prosecutor. Their conversation was too quiet to hear, but the prosecutor's face went from confused to shocked to something like embarrassed in the span of about 30 seconds. He kept shaking his head and saying, "I had no idea," over and over again. Finally, the woman walked toward the exit, and for just a moment, her eyes met James's. She gave him the smallest nod, not quite apologetic, not quite friendly, just acknowledging. Then she was gone, disappearing into the hallway outside. James pulled out his phone and quickly typed a message to his partner, Detective Helen Rodriguez. "You're not going to believe what's happening in court right now. Call you after." The 15 minutes felt like an hour. James watched other officers and lawyers drift in and out of the courtroom, preparing for cases that would be heard later that morning. A couple of them asked him what was going on, but he honestly didn't know what to tell them. How do you explain something when you don't understand it yourself? Finally, the bailiff returned and began directing people back to their seats. But something was different now. The clerk who had brought those papers earlier was setting up additional files at the bench. The prosecutor had been joined by what looked like a senior attorney from the district attorney's office, someone brought in to handle whatever complicated situation this had become. "All rise," the bailiff announced. But his tone was different now, less routine, more formal, and instead of Judge Foster's name, he said something that made James's stomach drop. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Catherine Brooks presiding." The side door opened, and the woman in the navy suit walked in, but she didn't walk to the defendant's table or to the gallery or anywhere James expected. She walked straight to the judge's bench. She climbed the steps, arranged her robes that she must have put on during the recess, and took her seat behind the bench where Judge Foster had been sitting just 20 minutes earlier. James felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. The woman he'd pulled over for running a red light wasn't just a lawyer or a courthouse employee. She was a judge. And not just any judge, but apparently the judge who was supposed to be in this very courtroom. Judge Brooks, because that's who she clearly was, looked out at the stunned courtroom with a calm, professional expression. "Please be seated," she said, and everyone slowly sank into their chairs, though the shock was visible on nearly every face. She took a moment to arrange her papers before speaking again. "I apologize for the confusion this morning. There was a miscommunication with the clerk's office regarding case assignments." She paused, and James could see her choosing her words carefully. "What makes this situation particularly complicated is that I am the defendant in case number 2847, the traffic violation case that was scheduled to be heard this morning." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Someone in the back actually gasped. The senior prosecutor who had been brought in looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Judge Brooks continued, her voice steady and clear. "Obviously, I cannot preside over my own case. That would be a fundamental violation of judicial ethics and the basic principles of justice. When I requested a different judge be assigned to this matter, there was apparently an error in the system and my case remained on my own docket." She looked directly at James then, and he felt pinned by her gaze. "Detective Peterson, I want to make something very clear. You did absolutely nothing wrong. When you pulled me over on September 23rd, you were professional, respectful, and you were doing your job exactly as you should. The fact that I'm a judge is irrelevant to whether or not I violated traffic law that day." James found himself nodding, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was agreeing to. His mind was still trying to process everything. "I also want to make it clear," Judge Brooks continued, addressing the entire courtroom now, "that I did run that red light. Detective Peterson's account of the incident is accurate. I'm not here to dispute the facts of the case. I'm here because I was unaware until this morning that the administrative reassignment of my case had not gone through properly." The senior prosecutor stood up, clearly uncomfortable. "Your Honor, if I may, this is highly irregular. I'm not even sure what the proper procedure is in a situation like this." "Neither am I, frankly," Judge Brooks admitted, and there was something almost human in that admission, a crack in the professional facade that made her seem more real. "In my 15 years on the bench, I've never encountered a situation quite like this. But here's what I do know. The law applies to everyone equally. It doesn't matter if you're a judge, a police officer, a lawyer, or anyone else. If you break the law, you face the consequences." She picked up a document and reviewed it briefly. "I'm going to formally recuse myself from this case right now. I will file the paperwork immediately, and a different judge will be assigned to hear this matter. Detective Peterson will need to return to testify at that hearing, and I will appear as the defendant, with proper legal representation." James couldn't help but feel a strange sort of respect for what he was witnessing. In all his years dealing with people who had broken the law, even minor laws, he'd seen every excuse, every attempt to get out of consequences. People lied, people blamed others, people claimed special circumstances. But here was someone with actual power, someone who probably could have made this whole thing disappear with a few phone calls, and she was doing the opposite. She was insisting on being held accountable. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said hesitantly. "Just to be clear for the record, you're admitting that you committed the traffic violation?" Judge Brooks looked at him steadily. "I'm stating that the facts as recorded by Detective Peterson are accurate. Yes, I ran that red light. I was distracted by a phone call regarding a family emergency. That's an explanation, but it's not an excuse. The law doesn't say you can run red lights if you have a good reason. It says you can't run red lights, period." She picked up her gavel and tapped it once. "This case is continued pending reassignment to another judge. Detective Peterson, thank you for your time today, and I apologize for wasting it. You'll receive a new summons once the reassignment is complete." James stood when everyone else did, still feeling like he was in some kind of strange dream. As Judge Brooks left the bench and the courtroom began to empty, he gathered his things slowly, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The senior prosecutor approached him as he headed for the door. "Detective, I just want to say, I've never seen anything like that in 20 years of practicing law." James shook his head. "Neither have I, and I've seen a lot of strange things." "She could have handled this very differently," the prosecutor said quietly. "Most people in her position would have, but she's not most people." As James walked out of the courthouse into the bright morning sunlight, he pulled out his phone to call his partner. Helen answered on the first ring. "Okay, I've been dying here." "What happened?" James laughed, though it came out a bit shaky. "Remember that traffic stop I did 3 weeks ago? The one I had to testify about today? Yeah? Well, I just found out I gave a traffic ticket to a judge. And then I almost testified against her in her own courtroom." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Helen said, "You're joking." "I wish I was." "Helen, you should have seen it." She could have made the whole thing go away, but instead she stood up there and basically said, "Yeah, I did it and I should face the same consequences as anyone else would." "Wow," Helen breathed. "That's either really principled or really stupid." James thought about Judge Brooks's calm face, her steady voice, the way she'd insisted on accountability, even when it would have been so easy to avoid it. "No," he said finally. "I think it's just honest. Maybe that's the same thing as principled. I don't know. But I'll tell you one thing. When I have to go back and testify in her actual trial, I'm going to tell the absolute truth. Because if she's willing to hold herself accountable like that, the least I can do is be completely honest about what I saw." "When do you testify again?" "No idea. They have to assign a new judge first." James climbed into his patrol car and sat there for a moment, keys in hand. "But something tells me this case is going to be talked about in this courthouse for a very long time." 2 weeks passed before James received the new court summons in the mail. During those 2 weeks, the story had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Everyone had an opinion about what Judge Brooks had done. Some people thought she was being unnecessarily dramatic. Others whispered that she was trying to make herself look good. But most people, especially the veteran officers and lawyers who'd been around long enough to see real corruption, they understood what she'd actually done. James had been approached by at least a dozen people wanting to hear the story firsthand. Each time he kept it simple and factual, the same way he'd write a police report. He didn't add drama or speculation. He just told them what happened. And every single time people would go quiet when he got to the part where Judge Brooks admitted her violation from the bench. "That took guts," his sergeant had said after hearing the story. "Real guts. There are cops who won't admit when they're wrong, let alone judges." Now James was back at the courthouse, walking down those same marble hallways, heading to courtroom 3A this time instead of 5B. The hearing was scheduled for T, and in the morning, and he'd arrived 15 minutes early out of habit. He'd testified in hundreds of cases, but somehow this one felt different, more important maybe, or just stranger. The courtroom was already buzzing with activity when he entered. He immediately noticed there were more people in the gallery than you'd normally see for a simple traffic violation. News had gotten around, apparently. He spotted a few reporters in the back row, notebooks ready. A couple of law students were whispering to each other, probably here to see how the whole thing would play out. And there at the defendant's table sat Judge Brooks. She wasn't wearing her robes today. Instead, she wore a simple gray suit, her hair pulled back the same way it had been that day he'd pulled her over. Next to her sat an older man in an expensive-looking suit, her attorney, James assumed. She looked up as James entered, and their eyes met for just a second. She didn't smile or nod this time, just held his gaze for a moment before looking back down at the papers in front of her. There was something different about her today. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable. Not because she'd changed, but because she wasn't sitting up on that bench anymore. She was down here with everyone else, waiting to be judged instead of doing the judging. The prosecutor from the district attorney's office approached James. It was a different person than before, a younger woman named Lisa Chen, who James had worked with on a few cases. Detective Peterson, thanks for coming in again, she said, shaking his hand. I know this has been a bit of a circus. That's one way to put it, James replied with a slight smile. Lisa lowered her voice. Look, just between us, I want you to know that we're handling this exactly like we would any other traffic case. No special treatment, no going easy, but also no making an example out of her. Just straight down the middle. James nodded. That's how it should be. All rise, the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge Robert Chen presiding. Everyone stood as the judge entered. Judge Chen was a man in his early 60s with silver hair and glasses that made him look perpetually serious. James had testified in his courtroom once before, years ago. He remembered him being fair but strict, the kind of judge who didn't tolerate nonsense from anyone. Judge Chen took his seat and surveyed the courtroom with a practiced eye. His gaze lingered for a moment on the reporters in the back, and James could see a flicker of something, annoyance maybe, cross his face. But when he spoke, his voice was calm and professional. Good morning. We're here for case number 2024 T8847, the People versus Catherine Brooks. He looked directly at the defendant's table. Judge Brooks, I want to address something before we begin. Judge Brooks stood. Yes, Your Honor. You and I have served on the bench together for over a decade, Judge Chen said. We've had coffee together. We've attended the same conferences. We've consulted each other on complex legal matters. Under normal circumstances, I would have recused myself from this case due to our professional relationship. The courtroom went completely silent. James could feel everyone leaning forward slightly, waiting to hear what came next. However, Judge Chen continued, you specifically requested that I hear this case. Your attorney filed a motion stating that you did not want any special considerations made due to our relationship, and that you believed I would handle this matter fairly and without bias. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Judge Brooks replied, her voice steady. I trust you to apply the law as it's written, regardless of our professional association. Judge Chen nodded slowly. Very well. I accepted this assignment because I believe I can be impartial, and because I respect your desire to be treated like any other defendant. But let me be clear. For everyone in this courtroom, and especially for those taking notes in the back, this case will be handled by the book. No favors, no special treatment. Clear? Yes, Your Honor, Judge Brooks said. Then let's proceed. Judge Chen looked at the prosecutor. Ms. Chen, call your first witness. The people called Detective James Peterson to the stand. James stood and made his way to the witness box for the second time in 2 weeks. He swore the oath again, stating his name and badge number, and then settled into the chair. The courtroom felt heavier this time, weighted down by all the attention, all the expectations. Lisa Chen approached with her notes. Detective Peterson, can you tell us about your encounter with the defendant on September 23rd of this year? James took a breath and began. On that date, at approximately 3:47 in the afternoon, I was positioned at the intersection of Hamilton Street and Fifth Avenue. I was monitoring traffic and conducting speed enforcement. What did you observe? I observed a black 2019 Honda Accord entering the intersection after the traffic signal had turned red. The light had been red for approximately 4 seconds before the vehicle entered the intersection. And what did you do? I activated my emergency lights and initiated a traffic stop. The vehicle pulled over without incident about 2 blocks from the intersection. Lisa nodded, making a note. Can you describe your interaction with the driver? James glanced at Judge Brooks. She was watching him, her expression neutral but attentive. The driver was cooperative. She rolled down her window immediately, had her license and registration ready. When I explained the reason for the stop, she didn't argue or make excuses. She accepted the citation without any issues. Did she say anything about why she ran the red light? James paused, remembering. She mentioned that she'd received a phone call about a family emergency and had been distracted. But she also said that wasn't an excuse, just an explanation. She acknowledged that she'd made a mistake. And you had no idea at the time that the driver was a judge? No, I did not. Her license identified her as Catherine Brooks, but I had no reason to know her profession. Even if I had known, it wouldn't have changed how I handled the situation. Why is that? Because a traffic violation is a traffic violation, James said simply. It doesn't matter who commits it. The law applies to everyone. Lisa smiled slightly. Thank you, Detective. No further questions. Judge Brooks's attorney stood up, a distinguished man named Gerald Hampton, who James had learned was one of the most respected defense attorneys in the city. He approached the witness stand with a friendly expression. Detective Peterson, in your 12 years as a police officer, how many traffic stops would you estimate you've conducted? James thought for a moment. Thousands. I couldn't give you an exact number. And in those thousands of stops, how many people have acknowledged their mistake and accepted responsibility without argument? Not many, James admitted. Most people either try to explain why they didn't actually do what I saw them do, or they get angry, or they make excuses. So Judge Brooks's response was unusual? Yes, it was. In fact, would you say her behavior during the traffic stop was exemplary? Lisa stood up. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant's demeanor during the stop isn't relevant to whether she committed the violation. Judge Chen nodded. Sustained. Mr. Hampton, stick to the facts of the violation itself. Of course, Your Honor. Gerald turned back to James. Detective Peterson, you testified that the light had been red for approximately 4 seconds when Judge Brooks entered the intersection. Were you timing it with a stopwatch? No, it was an estimate based on my observation and experience. Could it have been 3 seconds? 2 seconds. James shook his head. It was at least 4 seconds. I'm certain of that. The light cycle at that intersection is consistent, and I'd been watching it for about an hour at that point. I know what 4 seconds looks like. And you're certain the defendant's vehicle had not already entered the intersection when the light turned red? I'm certain. The vehicle was still approximately 20 feet from the intersection when the light changed. There's no question that it was a clear violation. Gerald nodded as if he'd expected that answer. Detective Peterson, has anyone pressured you or attempted to influence your testimony in this case? The question caught James off guard. No. No one. No one from the district attorney's office suggested you should be tougher on Judge Brooks because of her position? No. And no one from the court system suggested you should go easy on her? No, James said firmly. I'm telling you exactly what I saw, the same way I would in any other case. Gerald smiled. Thank you, Detective. That's all I need. James stepped down from the witness stand, feeling oddly drained. As he returned to his seat, he caught Judge Brooks watching him again. This time she did give him a small nod, acknowledgement, maybe even gratitude. Not for lying or going easy on her, but for simply telling the truth. Judge Chen reviewed his notes for a moment, then looked up. Ms. Chen, do you have any other witnesses? No, Your Honor, the people rest. Mr. Hampton? Gerald stood. Your Honor, the defense calls Catherine Brooks to the stand. A murmur went through the courtroom. It was unusual for defendants to testify in traffic cases, especially when the facts weren't really in dispute. But then again, James thought, everything about this case was unusual. Judge Brooks stood and walked to the witness stand, raising her right hand as the bailiff approached with the Bible. And James found himself leaning forward, curious to hear what she would say. Judge Catherine Brooks placed her hand on the Bible and took the oath, promising to tell the truth. James watched as she settled into the witness chair, the same chair where countless defendants had sat before her, where she'd watched thousands of people testify over her 15 years on the bench. But now she was on the other side, and something about seeing her there felt both strange and oddly right. Her attorney, Gerald Hampton, approached with a gentle expression. Please state your name and occupation for the record. Catherine Marie Brooks. I'm a judge for the County Superior Court. Judge Brooks, can you tell us what happened on the afternoon of September 23rd? She took a breath, and James noticed her hands were folded calmly in her lap. No fidgeting, no nervous gestures, just quiet composure. I was driving home from the courthouse. It had been a long day. I'd heard 6 cases that morning and spent the afternoon working on some complicated rulings. I was tired, But that's not an excuse. What happened at the intersection of Hamilton and 5th? My phone rang. It was my daughter's school. My daughter is 16, and she has type 1 diabetes. The school nurse was calling to tell me that my daughter's blood sugar had dropped dangerously low, and they'd had to call an ambulance. Her voice remained steady, but James could hear the emotion beneath it. As a mother, you hear something like that and everything else just disappears. All I could think about was getting to the hospital. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the reporters had stopped scribbling notes and were just listening. I was so focused on what the nurse was saying that I didn't see the light change. I didn't see it turn yellow, didn't see it turn red. I just drove through that intersection without even realizing it until I saw the police lights behind me. What did you do then? I pulled over immediately. I was shaking. Part of me was terrified about my daughter, and part of me had just realized what I'd done. When Detective Peterson came to my window, I was honest with him about the phone call, but I also told him that it didn't excuse what happened. Because it doesn't, Gerald nodded slowly. Judge Brooks, in your 15 years on the bench, how many traffic cases would you estimate you've presided over? Thousands, maybe 10,000 or more. And in those cases, how many times have you heard someone say they were distracted by an emergency? A sad smile crossed her face. Many times. Family emergencies, medical emergencies, work emergencies. People always have reasons. And I've always had to apply the law regardless of those reasons because that's how the law works. It has to be consistent. So you understand that your situation, while sympathetic, doesn't change the fact that you violated the law? I do understand that. Completely. Gerald paused, glancing at his notes. Your daughter, how is she? She's fine, thank you. By the time I got to the hospital, they'd already stabilized her blood sugar. She was released that same evening. But in that moment when I got that phone call, I didn't know she'd be fine. All I knew was that my child was in danger. Judge Brooks, why did you decide to fight this ticket instead of just paying the fine? She looked surprised by the question. I'm not fighting the ticket. I'm not here to argue that I didn't do it. Detective Peterson's account of what happened is completely accurate. I ran that red light. Now Gerald looked confused, and James realized this was probably a question he hadn't cleared with his client beforehand. Then why are we here? Because I wanted this handled in open court on the record with witnesses. I wanted it to be clear that I wasn't trying to make this go away quietly. I'm a judge. I hold people accountable for their actions every single day. How could I do that with any integrity if I didn't hold myself to the same standard? The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Chen tapped his gavel once. Order. Gerald recovered quickly. So you're prepared to accept whatever judgment this court determines? Yes. I'm prepared to face the same consequences anyone else would face for this violation. Even if that includes points on your license, a fine, and a permanent record? Yes. Even then. And you understand that as a judge, this could affect your professional reputation? For the first time, Judge Brooks's composure cracked just slightly. Her voice was quieter when she spoke. I hope that my professional reputation is built on 15 years of fair and honest service, not on whether or not I'm perfect. I made a mistake. A serious mistake. And I'm here to take responsibility for it. Gerald nodded. No further questions. Lisa Chen, the prosecutor, stood up. James could tell she was being careful, walking a fine line between doing her job and not appearing to attack someone who was being remarkably forthcoming. Judge Brooks, you mentioned that you were distracted by the phone call. Are you saying you didn't see the red light at all? That's correct. I was looking at the road, but I wasn't really seeing it. My mind was completely on my daughter. Do you always answer your phone while driving? No, in fact, I usually don't. But when I saw it was the school calling, I answered immediately. Again, that was my choice and my responsibility. You're aware that distracted driving is dangerous? Very aware. I've presided over cases involving accidents caused by distracted driving. Some of them had tragic outcomes. She paused. That's actually what makes this worse. I know better. I've seen what can happen, and I still made that choice. Lisa seemed almost reluctant to continue, but she pressed on. Judge Brooks, do you believe you should receive leniency because of your position? No, I believe I should receive exactly the same treatment anyone else would receive. What if someone argued you should face harsher penalties because you're a judge and should be held to a higher standard? Judge Brooks considered this carefully. I think there's validity to that argument. People in positions of authority should model the behavior we expect from others. If this court decides that my position as a judge warrants additional consequences, I'll accept that decision." Lisa nodded, seeming satisfied. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Brooks stepped down from the witness stand and returned to the defendant's table. The courtroom felt charged with emotion, respect, curiosity, even admiration from some corners. James found himself thinking about all the people he'd arrested over the years who'd made excuses, who'd blamed others, who'd done everything possible to avoid responsibility. And here was someone who could have avoided all of this, who had the connections and knowledge to make it disappear. And instead, she'd chosen to face it head-on. Judge Chen looked at both attorneys. "Does either side wish to present closing arguments?" Lisa stood. "Briefly, Your Honor, the facts of this case are not in dispute. The defendant ran a red light. Detective Peterson observed the violation clearly, and the defendant herself has confirmed that it occurred. While we understand there were extenuating circumstances, the law doesn't provide exceptions for emergencies. If it did, everyone would claim an emergency. The people asked that the court find the defendant guilty of the traffic violation as charged." She sat down and Gerald stood. "Your Honor, the defense doesn't dispute the facts either. Judge Brooks ran a red light. She's acknowledged this from the very beginning. What I want the court to consider is not whether she's guilty. She is. But rather what justice looks like in this case." He gestured toward Judge Brooks. "This is a woman who has dedicated her career to upholding the law. She made a mistake in a moment of genuine crisis, and she's been completely honest about it. She's not asking for special treatment. She's not asking for leniency. She's simply asking to be treated fairly, the same way she's treated thousands of people who have appeared in her courtroom." Gerald paused, letting his words sink in. The defense believes that the appropriate penalty in this case is the standard penalty for a first-time traffic violation. A fine and points on her license, nothing more and nothing less. Judge Brooks has already paid a price for this mistake in the form of professional embarrassment and public scrutiny. She's shown more accountability than most defendants ever show. We ask the court to impose the standard penalty and nothing more." Judge Chen listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When Gerald sat down, the judge reviewed his notes in silence for what felt like several minutes. The entire courtroom waited, barely breathing. Finally, Judge Chen looked up. "This is certainly one of the more unusual cases I've handled in my career. I've thought carefully about what justice means in this situation, and I want to address several points." He looked directly at Judge Brooks. "First, I want to acknowledge your honesty and integrity throughout this process. You could have handled this very differently, and no one would have blamed you for trying to resolve it quietly. The fact that you insisted on facing this openly speaks to your character." He paused. "However, character and circumstances don't change the facts. You committed a traffic violation. You've admitted as much. The question before me is what the appropriate consequence should be." James leaned forward in his seat, as invested in this outcome as he'd ever been in any case. Around the courtroom, everyone else was doing the same, waiting to hear what would come next. "I've heard arguments that you should receive leniency because of your honesty," Judge Chen continued. "I've also considered the argument that you should face harsher penalties because of your position. I'm going to reject both of those arguments." He picked up his gavel, holding it but not yet striking it. "Judge Brooks, you asked to be treated like anyone else. That's exactly what I'm going to do. For the traffic violation, I'm imposing the standard fine of $350, plus 3 points on your license. Additionally, I'm requiring you to complete a defensive driving course within 60 days. Judge Brooks stood. "Thank you, Your Honor." "I'm not finished," Judge Chen said, and the courtroom tensed again. "There's one additional matter I need to address." The courtroom held its collective breath. Judge Brooks remained standing at the defendant's table, her posture straight but her face showing just a hint of uncertainty for the first time that day. James felt his own chest tighten, wondering what was coming next. Judge Chen set down his gavel and folded his hands on the bench. "As I said, I'm imposing the standard penalty for this violation. But there's something else that needs to be addressed, and it has nothing to do with the traffic ticket itself." He paused, and James could see him choosing his words carefully. "Judge Brooks, you've served on this bench for 15 years. In that time, you've built a reputation as a fair and principled judge. I've watched you handle difficult cases with wisdom and compassion. I've seen you make tough decisions that weren't popular but were right. Where was he going with this? James glanced around the courtroom and saw the same confusion on other faces. What happened today demonstrates exactly why people trust you, Judge Chen continued. You made a mistake, and instead of hiding from it or using your position to make it disappear, you faced it with complete honesty. You held yourself to the same standard you hold others to. That's not common, Judge Brooks. That's actually quite rare. Judge Brooks's expression remained neutral, but James thought he saw her eyes glisten slightly. However, Judge Chen said, and the word hung in the air like a weight, there is the matter of judicial conduct. As judges, we're held to ethical standards that go beyond simply following the law. We're expected to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. The question I need to consider is whether this incident, not the traffic violation itself, but the circumstances surrounding it, requires any formal action. The courtroom erupted in whispers. A formal judicial conduct review could mean anything from a simple notation in her file to suspension or even removal from the bench. James felt a surge of something, anger maybe, or just unfairness. She'd done everything right after making one human mistake. Judge Chen raised his hand for silence. I've reviewed the Judicial Conduct Code carefully. I've consulted with the Ethics Committee, and I want to be very clear about my findings. He looked directly at Judge Brooks. Using your phone while driving showed poor judgment. Running a red light endangered yourself and others. Those are serious matters. However, they are matters of traffic law, which we've already addressed. They don't constitute judicial misconduct. James could almost feel the relief washing through the courtroom. What does reflect on your judicial character? Judge Chen continued, is how you handled the situation afterward. You could have used your position to your advantage. Instead, you insisted on transparency and accountability. You didn't ask for favors. You didn't try to influence the outcome. In fact, you've set an example that I hope other judges, myself included, would have the courage to follow if faced with similar circumstances. He picked up a document from his desk. I'm going to file a report with the Judicial Ethics Committee about this case. Not as a complaint, but as a commendation. What you've done here today is what every judge should do when they make a mistake. Own it, face it, and accept the consequences. That's not misconduct. That's integrity. Judge Brooks's voice was thick with emotion when she spoke. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me, Judge Chen said. I'm just recognizing what you did. The thanks should go to people like Detective Peterson, who did his job without consideration for who you were, and to prosecutors like Ms. Chen, who handled this case with professionalism and fairness. This is what justice looks like when everyone does their part correctly. He struck his gavel once. Court is adjourned. As everyone stood, the courtroom erupted in conversation. Reporters rushed for the exits, probably calling their editors. Law students clustered together, discussing what they'd just witnessed. James stood slowly, processing everything that had happened. Judge Brooks was speaking quietly with her attorney, nodding at something he was saying. Then she turned and looked across the courtroom, her eyes finding James. She said something to Gerald Hampton, who nodded, and then she walked toward James. He met her halfway, suddenly unsure of what to say. She extended her hand and he shook it. Detective Peterson, I owe you an apology, she said quietly. James was surprised. For what? For putting you in this situation, for the confusion that first day in court, for making you testify twice when once should have been enough. This whole thing has been complicated and you got caught in the middle of it through no fault of your own. James shook his head. You don't owe me an apology. You didn't do anything wrong. I mean, besides the traffic violation, and you've taken responsibility for that. Everything else you did was right. I made your job harder? Maybe, James admitted. But you also reminded me why I do this job. I've pulled over a lot of people over the years. Most of them lie to me. They blame someone else, they make excuses, they try to talk their way out of it. But you were different. You were honest from the start, even though it would have been so easy not to be. Judge Brooks smiled slightly. I spend my days trying to get to the truth. It would be pretty hypocritical if I didn't tell it myself when it mattered. Can I ask you something? James said. Of course, why did you really do all this? The public hearing. Insisting on a different judge testifying in your own case. You could have just paid the fine quietly. No one would have known. She was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Do you have children, Detective? 2, a boy and a girl. 9 and 12, then you understand. When my daughter was in that hospital, when I thought something terrible might happen to her, I made a promise to myself. If she was okay, I was going to be a better person. A more honest person. I was going to live up to the values I claimed to have, not just talk about them. She gestured around the courtroom. All of this, the transparency, the accountability, this is me keeping that promise. My daughter is fine, thank God, and now I have to be fine too. I have to be the person I want her to think I am. James felt a lump in his throat. She's lucky to have you. I'm lucky to have her. Judge Brooks glanced at her watch. I should go. I'm picking her up from school today. But thank you, Detective, for your honesty and for doing your job the right way. The system only works when people like you do what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. She turned to leave, then stopped and looked back. And Detective, the next time you're in my courtroom, as a witness, I'll remember this. I'll remember that you treated me the same way you'd treat anyone else. That matters more than you might realize. James watched her leave the courtroom, her head held high despite everything she'd been through. Gerald Hampton followed her out, and then the prosecutors packed up their things and left. Soon the courtroom was nearly empty except for James and a few stragglers. He pulled out his phone and called his partner Helen. She answered immediately. Well, what happened? James smiled. Standard fine, 3 points on her license and defensive driving course. Same thing anyone else would get. That's it? That's it. Judge Chen actually commended her for how she handled everything. Helen laughed. Wow. I bet the reporters were disappointed. They probably wanted drama. Oh, there was drama, James said. Just not the kind they expected. Helen, I've been doing this job for 12 years and I've never seen anything like what happened today. Someone with real power, someone who could have made this whole thing disappear, chose not to. She chose accountability. Sounds like she's one of the good ones. Yeah, James agreed. She really is. He left the courthouse and walked to his car, feeling something he hadn't felt in a while. Hope, maybe. Or just renewed faith in the system he'd dedicated his career to serving. It was easy to get cynical in this job, to assume that people with power always abused it, that justice was just a word without real meaning. But today, he'd seen something different. He'd seen someone with everything to lose choose to do the right thing anyway. And that mattered. It mattered a lot. 3 months later, James was back in Judge Brooks's courtroom, testifying in an assault case. When he finished his testimony and was dismissed, Judge Brooks thanked him for his service. Their eyes met for just a second, and there was understanding there, a shared memory of that strange day when everything got turned upside down. As James left the courtroom that day, he passed a young officer in the hallway who looked nervous about his upcoming testimony. First time testifying? James asked. Yeah, the young officer admitted. I'm a little nervous. Judge Brooks is tough but fair, James told him. Just tell the truth exactly as you remember it. That's all she wants. That's all any good judge wants. Thanks, the officer said, looking a bit more confident. James continued down the hallway, thinking about truth and justice and accountability. He thought about Judge Brooks sitting at the defendant's table, accepting responsibility for her mistake. He thought about Judge Chen's words about integrity, and he thought about his